Let me move on and talk a little bit now about critical theory and that critical turn and the impact that had on research. I've sort of titled this critical theory, and I've talked a little bit about the sort of Marx's origins of that. And in the lecture on critical theory, I'll talk more extensively about that. But I'm interested in this as a research approach, and as a research approach, you get into approaches which would be considered as forms of activism and forms of transformative research and development that truly connects with change, movements and resistance, and so on. As I alluded to, it sort of grew out of Marxism and feminism and research that was done within those frames was very much informed by lenses tied to the different critical theoretical dispositions of those movements. It also was moved along by, I think, by a colleague of mine at one point, Patty Lather, who expressed her concern about qualitative research in terms of the issues of participation that I talked about earlier. She coined a term, a validity concept, catalytic validity, in conjunction with a discussion that she was engaged in of key qualitative research, the Paul Willis study, Learning to Labour, and the Carol Gilligan study, In a Different Voice, looking at the moral development work of Lawrence Kohlberg from a feminist perspective. And she raised a question with those two studies of, again, Paul Willis's study of factory workers in England, and Carol's work with women, talking about development as to, well, what did they do relative to interacting with the people in terms of the results, in terms of the theoretical frame. And while she considered the research on qualitative or constructivist terms to be done quite carefully and rigorous, she found herself very concerned, in a sense, with the validity, what you call the catalytic validity, in terms of the lack of interaction about the results in a transformative way with the participants. It was again as if one was doing a study not fully in partnership in a transformative way with the people that they were studying. In a sense, reflecting a concern that critical theorists were making, that oftentimes researchers get into this objectification, verging on commodification of people, when they should be asking what should they be doing in conjunction, in collaboration, in their interest in a democratic, self-determinant, participatory, collaborative sort of way. It is interesting that critique fits with that sort of post-colonial critique that I talked about relative to anthropologists. A recent critique in a similar fashion just came out in the Comparative Ed Review, where they're looking at the history of comparative ed. And again, sort of highlighting the fact that too often comparative education also had been done in this fashion where people were doing research about people, of people, not with them or for them, in a way that was emancipatory. And so the critical theoretical stuff fits very much in with a sort of a form of attempt to sort of shift research in terms of its ethics, in terms of its validity, to an orientation that is not going to be critiqued in sort of post-colonial terms or neoliberal terms, where research is a form of commodifying people as research objects. So the interesting question becomes one of, how does one carry out research in a transformative fashion with people? And I think probably the group that has gotten a better handle on that than other groups are Indigenous scholars. And I think to some extent, some Canadians, if you look at the ethical guidelines for Indigenous research in Canada, you get certainly a fair amount of guidance by that. But in particular, if you look at the work being done in New Zealand by people like Linda Smith, you'll learn a lot about the expectations of cultural groups, particularly Indigenous groups, relative to the approach they expect relative to their engagement in research. It's participatory, it's respectful, it's reciprocal. It's done not with individuals but with the community. And as one sort of begins to think about education research and sort of shifting the expectations in terms of how it's mobilized, how it's negotiated, and how it's carried out for whose purposes, and whose intellectual property it is, you start to sort of see how a critical, theoretical, activist, transformative frame begins to reshape how you might do research. Interestingly, I think it's only now that we're starting to sort of see the emergence of really strong activist research as people engage with others on their behalf in an emancipatory sort of fashion. But again, one has to be very careful, because as one moves globally, one's expectations or one's view of what's emancipatory in one community might not be the same in other communities. Indeed, I think one of the most interesting things I've read in the last couple of years was a review by Chinese of US critical theorists, and the extent to which their models of empowerment might not fit with the Chinese culture. Likewise, and this goes back to Linda and Graham Smith's work in New Zealand, where they clearly highlight how those sorts of issues need to be negotiated with the community. And the instantiations of issues of liberation and empowerment involve people in different ways, and different people in those communities to what might be presupposed. And those issues heighten, I think, these days, particularly with the increased globalization of technology and the ease with which one can engage in others and very quickly find oneself taking over their personal or private property, in a sense, or characterization, and making it a global object on the internet. But again, if we look at critical theory and activism, there are some interesting examples. One that is often referred to as one of the better examples of transformative research is termed action research, design experiments, and the teacher as a reflective practitioner. And so a number of people, Joel Kinchlow, Ira Shaw, and others, have written a lot about the teacher as researcher. And when you think about the teacher as researcher, you're sort of saying, well, that doesn't seem to me to be critical. But when the teacher's the researcher, you're changing the role of the teacher significantly relative to the research project. It is the teacher's classroom, so immediately it's related to what's going on in the classroom in the interest of the students in terms of their learning, and what is this the teacher might pursue in his or her teaching relative to improving her practice or exploring her practice. And so the teacher is very much involved in key decision making relative to the focus, relative to her engagement in the thinking, and certainly her engagement in the activities that are explored. So I think I would tend to agree that the sort of action research and the teacher as inquirer or as a researcher is a really interesting example of a way by which, in a sense, critical pedagogy can take place in a sort of a transformative way that's directly connected to practice, and in a manner which sort of deals with the issues of catalytic validity and participatory type of work.